Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. Welcome back to you too, Ben. How are you?
G'day, mate. How you going?
Very good. Hey, you must be out of lockdown. You got a haircut.
I've had a haircut. I'm out of lockdown. Yes. Well done to the Melburnians for sticking in there. Bit of
mate, we've got a whole heap of crew in our
fortitude.
Team. Yes, mate. It's lockdown. I must admit I can't really relate because you said to me yesterday when I was chatting to you, "Oh, mate, we're off for dinner," and I'm thinking, "Oh, that's right. You haven't even been able to go out for a bite to eat," whereas I haven't necessarily been experiencing that. So yes, I agree that it's been a phenomenal effort by a phenomenal group of Australians who have done what they've done to get the curve flattened again. So, mate, good to see you back out and about.
Yeah, well done, everyone in Melbourne and Victoria for that matter. They still had to, suffer through a pretty difficult time. So we're hopefully out the other side of it until the third wave comes, which who knows when that's going to be. Or if it's going to be a vaccine or is it going to be a third wave?
Okay. Well, for all the Victorians who have been through a second wave, Ben, I don't really want to hear about the third wave.
No, keep getting tested, everyone. If you're not feeling well, please get tested because that's how it spreads.
Yeah, exactly. So a couple of things. Just congratulations to the Richmond Tigers, the Melbourne Storm, and the Brisbane Broncos, because there was clearly some amazing results. So we won't.
Hey, Bryce, in the women NRL, right, the WNRL, the Brisbane Broncos I think it's the 3 seasons, have only ever lost one game.
Yeah, right.
That's an incredible start to a dynasty.
Yes.
When we talk about dynasties, they've never one game in one regular season 1 year, but they've never lost.
Well, the Broncos franchise has been successful for a long period of time, particularly. Storm has dominated of late, but the Broncos.
The men are struggling, mate. They've had a lot of problems up there in terms of the coaches and players, and so the guys on the female side flying. On the male side.
Well done, ladies. Well done to there was in our household, Ben, as you know, I'm split, one tiger, one cat. Yep. I was talking to my eldest son, Jack. I dropped his mate off at halftime because he stayed to watch the game. And I was coaching Jack into, mate, your younger brother, we've got to nurture him because, the Cats are 22 points up. And I'm thinking, because I'm watching Sam, everyone in the house is going for the Cats except for Sam. Yeah. And he's so reactive. I'm thinking, this isn't great. So I'm actually coaching Jack through just be gracious, be humble. We've got to look out for Sam as well. And then, of course, turned around. So well done, teams. It's on again next year. Hopefully Fremantle will be up there next year, Ben. And I won't leave any space for you to heckle me.
Always good to dream, mate. Always good to dream.
Hey, guess what, Ben? We have released a new podcast. Can you believe it? Property Couch has a sister or brother podcast. Right. Called The Armchair Guide to Property Investing. So you can go and check it out.
I can't remember doing that podcast, Bryce. What is it?
So it's you and I going through our book, chapter by chapter.
Right. Oh, very nice.
Do you remember turning up to that?
No, the YouTube series that we did, yes. So we've turned that into a podcast. Awesome.
So it was YouTube.
Check it out.
Do you want to have a think about that? Was it YouTube series or was it maybe Facebook Live?
Oh, Facebook Live. That's right. I know my social media.
Just because you got your red YouTube Live jumper on doesn't mean that we live towards YouTube. So go and check that out, folks. Details will be in the show notes.
I'm all over.
And Ben, we earlier in the year we launched our Start and Build course. We are going to do that again. So we're going to offer a discount. So what we're going to do is, for anyone who gives us, and we've done this before, Ben, so we're going to do it again. If you go onto iTunes and give us a rating on either of the two podcasts, the ones that we read out, we're actually going to give you a course free of charge straight away. Send you the deets. You can log in straight away, start consuming over 12 hours worth of amazing content. So that is coming up. So hang around for that, folks. But if you haven't had if this content has served you as being part of our community and you want to give us some feedback, 1 star is fine. We've got 1-star reviews, Ben. That is totally fine. Yeah. Our preference is 5, but anywhere on the spectrum that you want to let us know some feedback, We're happy to have that. And we have read them out before, Ben, and we have read out non-5-star reviews before as well.
We do.
So give us your honest feedback. Go on, let us know. And we'll be giving away in the next few weeks some courses, Ben, and we love to do that. Also, the summer series, we've done a shout out. We've got a few people putting their hands up now, which is brilliant. I'm so excited about that. So, folks, let us know if you want to be part of our summer series. Let us know if you've got a transformation that you want to share with other people, because we want to share that. So thepropertycouch.com.au/my story is the place you go for that. And also, if you've read our book, Make Money Simple Again, and you want to share your experience with that, Emma from our team would love to chat with you. We will go on a Zoom call. We might record it with your permission, and we'll turn that into a video that we can share with the community as well. So if you've enjoyed Make Money Simple Again and you want to share your experiences with us, let us know. And lastly, Ben, we had a really good experience about 3 or 4 episodes ago. There was a series where we were reading out lots of people's speak pipes, where they'd go and put the details on and then read it out. So I just want to encourage more people to do that, because we love those. You'll jump straight up the queue with your question, and we'll put them on future episodes, which is really, really good. Hey, Mindset Minute, Ben. I've really enjoyed it. For anyone this is the first time they're listening and they haven't heard any of the previous sort of 14 or 13 episodes, I'm walking through How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I'm up to chapter 14. In part 3, How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking. There's a few key bits of gold here, Ben, that I've unpacked. So I'm going to go through it kind of quickly, because there's a lot to cover.
Sure.
But chapter 14 is the secret of Socrates. Secret of Socrates. All right, so here we go. So in talking with people, don't begin by discussing the things on which you differ. Begin by emphasizing and keep on emphasizing the things on which you agree. Keep emphasizing, if possible, that you are both striving for the same end, that your only difference is one of method and not of purpose. And here it is. Get the other person saying yes, yes at the outset. Keep your opponent, if possible, from saying no. A no response, according to Professor Overstreet, is a most difficult handicap to overcome. When you have said no, all your pride of personality demands that you remain consistent with yourself. You may later feel that the no was ill-advised, but nevertheless, there is a precious pride to consider. So the idea here clearly is that if you can get people into the rhythm of saying yes, that will achieve the end game that you're trying to achieve more so than if they start with a no. So hence, it is of the very greatest importance that a person be started in the affirmation. It is a very simple technique, and this is really important here. It is a very simple technique, this yes response, and yet how much is it neglected? It often seems as if people get a sense of their own importance. And if we remember, one of the previous ones, Ben, was the need for people to feel important, or as Tony Robbins says, significant. So it often seems as if people get a sense of their own importance by antagonizing others at the outset, Ben. So that what you said before about it's okay to dream, when I was talking about Fremantle, I don't think that was very affirming. I think that was antagonistic, Ben. So
really?
Take some
I
notes.
want you to be glass half full, not glass half empty.
Take some notes here, Ben. Socrates, the gadfly of Athens, was one of the greatest philosophers the world has ever known. He sharply changed the whole course of human thought. So what was his method? His whole technique, now called the Socratic method, was based on getting a yes, yes response. He asked questions in which his opponent had to agree. He kept on winning one admission after another until he had an armful of yeses. He kept on asking questions until finally, almost without realizing it, his opponents found themselves embracing a conclusion they would have bitterly denied a few minutes previously. So here it is as we wrap it up. The Chinese have a proverb pregnant with the old age wisdom of the Orient. He who treads softly goes far. So here's principle number 14. Get the other person saying yes, yes, immediately. There you go, Ben. Wisdom.
I love it.
Drips wisdom. I am thoroughly enjoying bringing out some of these gold points throughout, and I am getting some feedback that it is serving people, so I'm excited about that. But there you go, folks. Principle number 14. Get the other person saying yes, yes, immediately. There you go, Ben.
Love it, mate. Love it. What have we got today?
Ben, we're going to talk about some feedback that we got from a client. So to give it a little backstory, what happens is whenever we fulfill an assignment that's given to us within our business, we send out a little note to say to folks, can you tell us what we should keep doing, start doing, and stop doing? And one of the feedbacks caught my eye around what we should start doing. And I think in the response to the question, I think there's a lot of benefit for our community actually hearing what our response would be. So what I'll do is I'll actually read it out in its entirety. I'm not going to say the client's name because that's not important, but the feedback that was given is the really important thing. So
Correct.
I'll read it out and then we'll circle back and you and I will dissect it. So you up for that?
Love it.
All right, let's do it. So a lot of, and clearly this person is of a younger generation. A lot of millennials, in brackets, including myself, are skeptical about property and put off investing because we read/consume a lot of stuff that is bearish on property. I would also say that I found it difficult to listen to the podcast because it's too normy and doesn't address/contend with a lot of the current zeitgeist outside the mainstream media that people consume nowadays. In brackets, Zero Hedge, Martin North, Real Vision, Jolly Swagman podcast, Nassim Taylor, Steve Keen, and The Case for Crypto. I put off investing in property for years because of this sort of content saying that property is a pyramid scheme for boomers and that valuations are only maintained due to central bank policy and credit availability. Instead of dismissing this stuff as conspiracy theories, actually take it on and come up with persuasive arguments against it instead of relying on me taking 5 years to find them myself. Number one, admit that the current immigration levels are unsustainable politically and can't be a key driver of house prices. Number two, admit that the majority of growth in house prices is due to credit availability and decreasing interest rates. Number three, admit that there is nothing inherently different about Australia from, say, Ireland or Spain and their property crashes, in brackets, other than maybe the ability to print our own currency. And number four, admit the risk of a Japanese lost decade and drop in consumption and birth rates caused by high levels of household debt. I would have felt way better going into this, and just for context, this particular client actually did buy a property. So I would have felt way better going into this if I'd heard some strong arguments against this stuff. Having said all that, I want to invest in property because it's a human need and it will never go to zero, in brackets, wealth preservation. I remain skeptical of continued price growth, or in brackets, or at least real price growth, close brackets. However, I acknowledge that yes, the game is rigged for boomers, but what choice do I have? Question mark. Getting an SH1T return on real estate is better than doing nothing. If you want to get more, in brackets, smart millennials on board, you need to address this stuff. So there's a fair bit in that, Ben. And I guess we are going to unpack that piece by piece. But what's interesting is it's a pyramid scheme for baby boomers.
Yeah, I mean, if it was a pyramid scheme for baby boomers, what does it say about the late 1800s, when per capita Melbourne was the richest, sort of city on the planet? I'm not sure, that we need to just look at it from a baby boomer's point of view, but I think we do need to acknowledge a couple of important things here for our millennial folk. And there is definitely some headwinds that they've got. The first one is, the baby boomers had a pretty great run post-war, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the vast majority of them were immigrants, right? So, in terms of the country was opened up after the Second World War, and we have the $5 POMs or the $10 POMs, and the Italians, the Greeks, the Vietnamese. After we've had, and that has served us well in terms of the brilliant multicultural country that we have here today, and the prosperity that we've got, because these people came with nothing and they've made good, and they've aspired to do that. So, but with that also came free education, free university education, and that has not been possible for the millennial generation. So they are definitely starting on the back foot there. So I want to acknowledge that.
And also not a global economy really either, Ben. It was kind of still in-house in Australia growing up in the 60s and the 70s and right through to the turn of the century. It wasn't as a globalized force as we have now. So it was a great time to grow up in this country?
We were very prosperous, Bryce. So first of all, we've got abundance of natural resources.
Yes.
Then we did amazing things on the back of the sheep's back, right? In terms of growing out the economy, in terms of our agriculture. We're blessed in terms of the amount of food that we produce. We produce over 3 times our requirements and export that. We've got, and with aspiration, we now have a booming wine industry and all potentially, some more higher end goods that we sell. And also, we're blessed with, Nobel Prize winning scientists and those types of things. I would like to think that we would invest more in our science and technology area. I think that is going to be important for our next 100 years, but we have been blessed. So as much as I understand how millennials can feel that it has been a challenge for them, and obviously we sit here as sort of Y-Gen,
Gen X, mate.
Gen X, I should say, Gen X. So it's obviously difficult to hear this information from people who are
it's easy for them. Yeah,
it's easy for us because we also got those benefits. And so saving for a deposit is real. It is a definite challenge. It's a big challenge, right? I mean, it is, as we say, the most difficult challenge of all. Housing affordability is relative. Like in terms of, the median house price in Australia is $550,000. But the median house price in Sydney or Melbourne is definitely not $550,000. So it's relative to obviously the expectations that some of our millennials have, which is they want what they see. They want to live close to the city. They want all the spoils. And I get that. I get that. But that's not the full story of housing affordability. In other words, I grew up in a household that was 26 kilometres from the city. It was lower middle class in Bundoora. And my parents earned medium wages, maybe slightly above medium wages in the end of their careers. And now, I sit here earning probably 3 times what they earned in terms of that. So again, I can sit here and say, and what did I do? Well, I didn't move out wide. I picked up my future family and I moved closer to the city. And that income that I had was high enough for me to allow me to buy a substantial home in a higher net worth area. And so that's the cycle. Like some people, there's going to be a cohort of people who will be priced, and that's the biggest cohort of people in this country. And that's the cohort of people that basically have that ripple effect where, prices move out wider, land values move out wider. But to say that it's a pyramid, that it's a Ponzi scheme is not recognising the essence of basically what we're talking about here. And that is that what underpins the value of property is the land.
Yep.
And the land is going to appreciate if there is long-term demand on that. Yes, it's going to absolutely move in cycles. Yes, there's going to be some over-exuberance in terms of people are going to get ahead of themselves. Property prices are going to move higher in areas that they probably wouldn't, and we'll get into that in more detail in terms of interest rates as we go through those. But
just on that, Ben, because the Ponzi scheme, as you say, relies on effectively the people in early getting the returns from the people that keep coming in afterwards. So as long as people keep coming in afterwards, the returns keep flowing up the chain. But as soon as the last layer of people coming into a scheme, what's the most famous one? Bernie Madoff, was it Madoff?
Yeah, Maloof. Yeah, Bernie Maloof. Yeah, that's him in terms of the one in America. Yeah, so
that's the highest profile. It's a fascinating documentary if you ever get a chance to watch it. But the idea is that there is no intrinsic value in the scheme. It's just largely relied on more and more people coming. So I'm guessing the reference is that the baby boomers sit at the top of that and the millennials sit at the bottom. But I think the key point that you just talked about was the intrinsic value is the land and the real estate that is underneath it. And so therefore, if you have a scenario where you've got scarcity of land, scarcity of property, and more people chasing it, the value still exists. And when the music stops, you still have something in your hand. Whereas in a Ponzi scheme, when the music stops, the last people in come collapsing. But they're not the only ones who collapse. It's everyone all the way up the scheme as well.
Yeah, so I wanted to the scene setter for me was just about firstly acknowledging, hey, we realise that it's not as easy as you feel it is. I mean, in your world that you're looking at it, saving that deposit is not easy. But I suspect when you would talk to the baby boomers and you would talk to the Gen Xers and the like, they're probably going to tell you their story about how it was a bit challenging for them too, right? In terms of context. So we all have our mindsets and beliefs around that. That said, yes, in theory, the higher the value of the property, the larger deposit. But what has changed during that generation, because you've also got to remember in the baby boomer generation, if you didn't have a 20% deposit, you were not going to get into the property. And we are going to have a guest on the show in the coming weeks who is going to be another masterclass, right? And I've been fortunate enough to know Jock for a long time, but he talks about investing in property. You needed to, back in the 70s, you needed to get private funding. So through law firms and so forth. And the maximum you could get was a 60% loan to value ratio, and you're paying a premium for that money. So the difference of that, and what has also been a catalyst for potentially some of the growth, is what we call the debt and the leverage story. Was that we have, through lenders mortgage insurance, being able to open up the market to allow for people to borrow up to 95%. And obviously during the heady years of the early 2000s, pre-GFC, people were able to borrow 105% of the value of the home just based on their income story and not necessarily based on any deposit story. So that has definitely led to further demand elements that have played a role in where property prices are today. But so let's just acknowledge that for some people, absolutely tough.
And Ben, can I also acknowledge for the millennials too that the culture challenge that they face right now is uniquely different to what you and I faced, and particularly, say, even my parents, because my mum got married at 19, my dad got married at 28, so there's 9 years difference. But even Dad at 28 is still considered young these days. So
Yep.
I think one of the challenges that millennials have is just that shift in life cycle where, if you go back to my parents' generation, they would get married, buy a house, work their way up, start a family, all those sorts of things. Whereas millennials now, the norm is to, I want to make statements that are not overly generalistic, but given some of those major life decisions have been pushed further down the track, they have an opportunity to travel or start a new business or do a whole range of things that if you talk to my parents, they thought that's what you did at retirement. You didn't do it at the front of your life, you did it at the back of your life. So I think that therefore if you have a look at millennials, they're normal with their sphere of influence and their friends is to do a lot more now, spend on lifestyle now, so that you can accumulate these memories, you can accumulate these life experiences, which are fabulous, and I think it's terrific. But it's also meant that if you compare this generation to that's one of the reasons why baby boomers were able to get a foot on the property ladder, is because early they buckled down, they bought a property, they went out wide, and they moved in closely. So I don't want to be a Gen X who throws mud at millennials, because their choices are fine, and I see a lot of millennials having an amazing sort of period of time, right? And they all they knew was economic prosperity. So why wouldn't you go and do some of those things? But I think if we break it down, it's really just about what it takes when and what you want to prioritize on. Because even Eliza Owen said we've got four different measures of housing affordability, and the three of them were similar in any generation, but the fourth one that she made a point on, and you've touched on it, is the fact that saving for a deposit is a challenge, right? And so we acknowledge that it's a challenge. But it really comes down to, I can tell you, I know lots of millennials who have got on the property ladder, and so they really were at a fork in the road where they needed to make a choice on whether they wanted to go down that path or go down an existing path. But I just wanted to say there, I think the norm facing millennials is different to the norm facing me as an ex, and also baby boomers around the cultural norm at the time, because the cultural norm now is to really spend energy and effort on creating experience and for the now, which is counterintuitive to getting on to the property ladder.
Bryce, I mean, we only need to go back. History is a good teacher, right? So, and I don't know, let's call it the 13th and 14th centuries, 15th centuries. My understanding, it was that people were getting married in 13 or 14 years of age, right? Because they needed to jam pack a lot into their life, because I think, the
shorter.
average, was 40 odd years, right? You were dying from all sorts of things, from black plagues and all. Now, let's fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries. The same sort of thing with your parents, as you've documented with your dad. He's a post-war era, right? So they needed to jam everything in because their life expectancy was sort of 60, right? And so they were getting married earlier. Now, the life expectancy of the millennials coming through now is more like 90 to 100. And so they do have the luxury of being able to have a decade of enjoyment and so forth, if they want to travel and exploring a few things. And there's not that pressure to jam into starting a family and all that like our parents did, because they, ultimately their life expectancy was 65. So, that's obviously improved over time with technology and advancement and the beauties of science and medicine. So that's probably the context. So when you generalize, you're generalizing still based on fact, in terms of looking at, cohorts of groups. And that's what's happening. We are seeing millennials marry later, settle down later, and then start to focus on having children later. And I was probably in that cohort as well. I didn't have Jack until I was 39, as an example, right? So they're the types of stories that we can tell. So acknowledging what is a challenge, but also please don't take the mindset of, well, that's my place in the world. Part of what we do here on this podcast is about break the mold. Walk your own path. Bryce and I see great millennials, and we just heard from one of them now who's sort of saying, I'm not necessarily going to listen to those cohort of people who are telling me the world's caving in and it's harder for us than ever and it's a real disappointment and it's a shame and it's not fair. We've said all along that ultimately, if it is to be, it's up to me. And if you take a road less traveled, or if you take responsibility, not blaming other people or leaving that hard work, to religion, or leaving that hard work for the government to do, you've got to do the work on yourself. And those people who do that work will benefit from the actions that they take. So I think that's good. But let's get into the points that are raised there, Bryce.
Okay, so number one point, admit that the current immigration levels are unsustainable politically and can't be a key driver of house prices.
So the story that's framed up there is that there is definitely the belief on left wing of politics that any time we open up immigration, we're taking Australian jobs, and that is the position of a lot of key unions, to sort of say we need to employ Australians first before we look overseas to make those arrivals coming in for short-term visas or job visas or whatever. Now, contrary to that view, and there's obviously been a lot of research done in this particular area, and there's reference to a report that was released by the Committee of Economic Development in Australia, which is CEDA, that show that immigration has not harmed the earnings of local workers. And that research was released, and they did a solid study around that 70% of temporary skilled migrants resided in New South Wales and Victoria, which consequently also had the lowest rates of unemployment in Australia. And so we've tried to articulate that in very simple terms by sort of saying, the moment somebody arrives in this country to live here, they have requirements and needs. They have essential needs, which is shelter, and they also, food, clothing. So they need to set themselves up. So that is a new person coming in. They need to have transport. They need to go out to retail world. They need to have food prepared for them. They need to go to the supermarket. All of those things add to the net production of requirements in terms of consumption. And so when that consumption takes place, that actually has a flow-on effect in terms of creating more jobs. So as much as the politics will play out for the ill-informed, and that is, I'm sitting here unemployed, so that story resonates to me to sort of say, well, where's my jobs? But even through the pandemic, Bryce, we've heard of farmers looking to get their produce off their trees for the stone fruit season and just not being able to get the labour to be able to do that. We've seen, where was it in Vanuatu? A planes arrived from Vanuatu in Darwin so they can get the mangoes off the tree so we can have summer mango, right? So I think we need to always, when we see these generalisations, to be careful not to think that because it's too politically difficult. When on the back of, the Liberal Party was built by Sir Robert Menzies, and Sir Robert Menzies' great custodianship of the Australian economy was built on the back of migrants, was built on the back of building, in fact, the Great Australian Dream, allowing people to come out here and start a new life. When we do make that sacrifice, we do want to, show the rest of the world, or where we've come from in terms of our families and relatives back home, that we're making good.
Well, you point out Bernard Salt there, Ben. He wrote a book, The Big Shift, I read it back in the early 2000s, and he had this concept of the empty island syndrome, which was essentially saying, hey, listen, there's not a lot of people on that island, despite the fact that when you grow up, like I grew up thinking Perth was a big city, Ben. Now I go back and have a look at the skyline of Perth and think, wow, I used to really think this was a big place, right? But and that's not to discredit Perth, by the way. It's just, when you put it in context of Melbourne and Sydney, it's a smaller city. But that empty island syndrome is really saying, hey, listen, compared to, well, even if we think about earlier this year when we had the bushfires, I remember a lot of the commentary that was going on in the US was they would superimpose the continent of Australia and put it over the top of the USA. And quite a lot of them were like, wow, we had no idea that the size of what they are doing down there is actually almost the same land size as us. It's pretty big, right? But the difference between what the US does and Australia does is they build cities in the middle, whereas Australians only have these coastal congregations, and very rarely, with the exception of Alice Springs and a few inner places, we rarely go into the middle. So therefore, we've got this sovereign island, which is also a country, which is also a continent, that has an incredible standard of living, which as people look around the world, they'll see that this is a really enticing place to be. And we've got one of the highest standard of living in the world. So I guess the thing that I think of is if you're in a restaurant on a Friday night and it's your favorite restaurant, imagine sitting there and seeing all the people come in and you can't get a seat and all that sort of stuff. And you go, geez, this restaurant would be really great if all these people weren't here because I can get a seat straight away. And so that's in a vacuum, you go, sure. But it's a Friday night. There's always going to be people, and there's always going to want to be people in a great restaurant. So I feel like that has a kind of analogy for how we are in Australia. That wouldn't it be great if we could keep it the way it is and not have a lot of people want to come here because we live here and it's a great standard of living? But that's a closed view of what we get from opening it up and creating a scenario. As you mentioned before, we've got this wonderful multicultural scenario. So we need to play to win rather than play to lose. So I think whenever you've got your sporting team and they're up in the last quarter and they can see that they're in front and all of a sudden they start playing really defensively and the other team's attacking and they're going defensive. So they're playing not to lose rather than playing to win. And I feel like that's a good analogy for this discussion, because for us to be able to prosper economically and for us to continue to have the standard of living that we have, take away the politics. If we don't continue to have more people want to come and enjoy this lifestyle, it's very difficult for us to grow. And therefore, our economy will continue to either go sideways or go down, which has a negative impact on people living here because their standard of living will be challenged. And it goes on to, I'll revisit this when we get to point 4 of what this particular client talked about as well, because it ties into it with the reference to Japan. But Ben, I think it's not just a political discussion, it's a standard of living discussion for us to continue to enjoy the standard of living that we currently enjoy in this country. It is the greatest place on earth.
By a mile. And we only need to look with what's going to happen in America and what's been happening there and what's happening in the UK and our news feeds to sort of see just how lucky we are that we are, in this blessed country. So, yeah, I'm not sure that you'll see Scott Morrison and the current Liberal Party. I mean, they're already talking about seeing opportunity in terms of getting the talent pool out of Hong Kong. And that is the future, right? We do need, the thought leaders to come to this country and to take challenges and take risks to start businesses and to build out the economy. I mean, it's all well and good that we also obviously need to get work at all levels, right down to to accommodate everyone at every level of intellect to be able to do that. But if you don't start those businesses, there may not necessarily be jobs in different areas of the economy, and that's really important. So, we'll, by the sounds of things, we're going to be looking at our targeted immigration program, and I suspect post-COVID we will start to get back up to the sort of levels that we expected, and the population growth rates of that 1.4, 1.5 that we needed to get to, because we do know in terms of from a capacity point of view, we can accommodate them. We have enormous opportunity. There is enough water here. Our primary production can cover that. We can feed them. We will be able to house them. And that's part of that journey. Now, I'm not saying capitalism's perfect. I don't want to have that conversation. That's a conversation. It is not perfect. And we absolutely want to see a thriving middle class. And really, our podcast is really designed around the concept of if people look after their money, control it, buy a couple of properties sensibly, add that to their superannuation, then all of a sudden they're less of a burden government purse, and they can live comfortably and continue on with the lifestyle that they've come to enjoy while they were working. That's really it. Right? That's our purpose. That's our mission in terms of being able to do that. Bryce and I often talk about a scorecard that we have in terms of what we take versus what we left behind, or what we give. Right. So how much did we take versus how much did we give? And as long as we always keep that in equilibrium in terms of giving more than we take, and if everyone took that approach in life, the place would be the world would be a far better place.
Here. So the question that you've said here, our client, admit that the current immigration levels are unsustainable politically and can't be a key driver of house prices. Therefore, we can't admit that, Ben.
Yeah.
based on what we're saying. So, because we actually do think that this empty island will continue to be attractive and will continue to attract people, and we actually think it's good for growth.
Well, you think about Kevin Rudd quickly said, I believe in a big Australia, and he got shot down by the unions because that was what does a big Australia means. It looks like more immigration and so forth. And we do know that obviously socially we are getting challenged by views that are popping up in social media, in terms of racism is starting to show its face in some parts of the world. It's really destructive. The news feeds and all of that from our different sort of media outlets, all very destructive. But what you do find is it'll just come off the agenda in terms of the media cycle, and they'll just bring those people in. Right? They'll handle it when they can, but they don't want to talk about it because they understand that most people have this simple view that it does, that it is politically challenging. But I tell you what, we keep bringing in the 300,000 or 400,000 people pre-COVID, and I suspect that will just continue to keep happening as businesses identify, skills shortages that they have and apply for those visas, and those visas get approved and those people arrive. So I think that'll happen just in the background.
So it's a scarcity versus abundance sort of mindset. Correct. In terms of there is enough to go around, and the people coming are it's not one job, two people competing for one job. The idea is that bringing someone else will create another job. Correct. And then having someone else come in will create another job. So it's not about taking from people. It's about creating more opportunity, and including more opportunity for our kids to go up the corporate ladder, whatever they choose, for their own professional life. So that's number one. Number two, Ben, is asking us to admit that the majority of growth in house prices is due to credit availability and decreasing interest rates. Interesting, because there is a component of that's actually true.
It is 100% true.
What I will say about credit availability is I think credit availability in this country is higher barriers to entry than some of the other countries that have seen challenge, including the US during the GFC, including some of the European countries, which we'll talk about shortly. But look, we are on this podcast as saying that the borrowing capacity has been increased from back in the typical life cycle of the 70s, where you have had increase in household cash flow via one income becoming 1.5 incomes, becoming 2 incomes, becoming the potential for 2 full-time professional incomes. So clearly that's an organic increase in the amount of cash flow coming in. And the recession we had very high interest rates versus where we are now at unbelievably low. So yes, those things have contributed to increasing borrowing capacity, which has had increasing results in seeing prices grow. But whether or not that growth is only because of that, well, we've had decrease in household sizes, Ben. So we've gone from 2.3 household sizes now to an increase in single people living on their own, which is increasing the demand there. And you've also had what we talked about before in population growth. So that is part of the equation, but it's not the underpinning and the only reason why there's been house growth.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, in terms of demand drivers, you raise those points beautifully, Bryce. We need shelter. Shelter is provided to humans in single household form, double household form, family household composition form, flatmate form, whatever that looks like. So population growth does create a demand. And obviously immigration and birth death rate, it plays a role in that. But in terms of what is a property worth, it does come down to very much the ability to actually borrow money, which is completely, there's a clear correlation to income, because if you don't have income, you can't borrow money. Now, the story of the rising tide lifting all ships has been a product of interest rates peaking during the early 1900s as productivity was poor, as inflation was out of control, and then Keating rebooted the economy. And so you just need to look at how historical interest rates have come down, which has obviously meant that people could borrow more. And that has ultimately been part of that story, because at the end of the day, true demand is only a product of people's ability to be able to afford it. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we've had the ripple effect where property prices have continued to grow, even not only in the inner city areas, but also in the outer city areas, because the reality is that the largest cohort of demand is driven by their affordability, because they are in a regression to the mean. They have pretty average wages, everyone, and then there's slightly different cohorts which have higher incomes, and they are a smaller cohort, but they also potentially have the ability to, where borrowing power is not relevant to them because they've got so much income, that they potentially look at buying assets based on status and human interest and human behaviour. And that's why economics is not just a study of pure demand and supply that sets a price, but it is also around behavioural economics and why we decide and justify to ourselves that we are going to pay that price, because there is trust in the marketplace that the next person that's going to come along is going to pay a similar price or a higher price, and that's how prices are set. So yes, when you do have interest rates low, incomes have been growing, softening in the last couple of years, absolutely, and that is something that you should be mindful of in terms of future long-term capital growth in properties, in terms of if the average person and the average marketplace isn't going to see lots of income growth over time, then property prices could stagnate in the more general market. That's a generalised statement. So you then potentially got to look at marketplaces where property is not seen as a form of shelter, it's actually seen as an asset class or a measure of success or a measure of status. Because again, I can go out and buy a Suzuki Swift for $12,000 to get around town, or I can go out and buy a $500,000 Rolls Royce, and it performs the same service, but the reality is that there is a smaller cohort of buyers, but that's the scarcity piece and the quality piece, and so people justify it to themselves in terms of what that asset's worth, and what they're willing to pay. So I concur that this is a story of debt, and we need to be mindful of that. And what we have also evidenced, Bryce, is APRA has potentially found the lever that they can play with, which was evidenced in 2017, 2018, where they started to play with the assessment rate, which is a throttle on borrowing power. Whereas responsible lending is not a throttle on borrowing power. It was the wrong type of approach. This is a better approach. So as I said, don't think that APRA and the RBA are mindful of asset bubbles. They are incredibly mindful of it. And that could be hugely damaging if they let that bubble evolve. And that's where they've potentially got levers that they can play with outside of just interest rate levers around that sort of assessment throttle.
Some of the credit availability dialogue too, Ben, goes back to if you only go back to the GFC, there was Jingle Mail, there was Ninja Loans. They were the acronyms, but Jingle Mail is essentially where in America you have non-recourse lending, which basically means if you can no longer pay the loan, send them the keys back to the bank and walk away. In Australia, you can't do that. We have recourse lending, right? They will go to your heirs to get the money back. So first of all, is that. And then the other part of the credit availability is the Ninja loan was no NI, no income, NJ, no job, and then the A was for no assets. So the amount of money that was being made available to people who weren't in a position where they could really afford it or didn't have a track record to suggest that they were great credit risk were getting money. And therefore, if you're throwing this money into a system and that's creating demand, clearly that has upward pressure on prices. But we don't have that here in Australia, Ben. We have recourse lending, and particularly over the last few years, the ability to get loans has been as challenging as ever, right? So again, in addressing this direct question around it, admit that the majority of growth in house prices is due to credit availability and decreasing interest rates. Well, not the majority, but it is a contributor. And as you said, we've got to be mindful of it. But there are other things at play. But let's be clear around credit availability around the world and some of the ramifications of the easy access to credit, which is a negative sign towards a boom that's a boom bust cycle, versus the credit availability conditions that we have in Australia, shouldn't at this point in time let people be uncomfortable around people borrowing money when they don't have the ability to service it. They should have comfort in the fact that we are consistently given high ratings in even what you said before around the regulators. The regulators are acutely aware that increasing hyperinflationary property price cycles don't serve anyone at all. And given the fact that it's too big to fail, residential property in this country, we won't fall asleep at the wheel on property.
I agree.
So number 3, Ben, admit that there is nothing inherently different about Australia from, say, Ireland or Spain and their property crashes, in brackets, other than maybe the ability to print our own currency. So
firstly, on printing currency, that devalues your currency, right? So there's always a danger in sort of that approach. And well, I'm not going to go down the modern monetary theory umbrella today because we've got enough to talk about already. But what I do want to talk about is different marketplaces. So in Australia, we have stamp duty that we pay as a one-off when we come into a property. And that's the only duties outside of the rates that we pay for our property in terms of its ongoing care and maintenance. We have things like the ability to claim interest if we're investing in property for a return. That's considered an investment, so we can claim the interest as part of the cost base, which is part of our tax system for the last 100 years. We have, and I'm not thrilled about this, but we have state-based property legislation. For a country of our size is ridiculous, but we do. But then if we go to New Zealand, you don't pay capital gains tax on investment properties. You go to America, they actually don't pay stamp duty as an upfront cost. They pay an annual tax on their property. In fact, in some states, you can also claim the interest on owner-occupied debt.
Which is why it's confusing, Ben. What you just said then is why a lot of American commentators confuse Australian people, because even if you read one of the all-time classic books, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Ben, that becomes a mixed message where people read that and they go, oh, should we be investing in property here? Yeah, well, the conditions are different.
And Bryce, wait for this one, because I don't think I've told you about this one. We've got a client in Switzerland at the moment, right? And I've done some modelling for him. Great mate of mine, actually, out of Sydney. G'day. So in terms of in Switzerland, Bryce, if if you get your property, your owner-occupied property, to a certain loan-to-value ratio, and we were talking about this being around sort of that 50 to 60%, you never have to pay your debt off, ever. So imagine that. So he's got a lovely property there in Switzerland, and I'm saying, Andrew, mate, surely that's not right. You can't be telling, because I'm trying to do these models in terms of his, retirement planning, and I'm saying, I need some evidence of this. He goes, no, my tax accountant's told you, right?
That's the first thing that ran into my mind.
So he did. I've got on my email from a Big Four tax accounting firm the definition of the principles that apply in Switzerland about not having to pay off owner-occupied debt. So you can get
the threshold?
And it's 60% loan to value ratio. So you can hold on to that debt. And I'm saying, well, whoever pays it off, he goes, well, that what they work on over there is whoever's going to buy the property. They're going to add value to the property into the future. I'm like, wow, so you only have to pay interest only indefinitely. Yep. And you never have to pay off that, and I think it was something like, 400,000 euro or whatever. You never have to pay it off. He goes, no. And I don't know whether in euro or whether, I think it's still Swiss franc. But I'm like, this is fascinating. Right? Now, so why do I mention those stories? In every country, there's a legislative framework that is the market maker. All right. And the decisions that are made around those markets are relative to what regulation, what laws are applicable in that marketplace. And so, by way of example, when we do talk about Ireland and we do talk about Spain and we talk about America, they all have very differing legislative laws, taxes, things that you have to pay, borrowing standards. In a past episode, I talked about the borrowing standards in Ireland, right, where the banks aren't able now to set their own rates. Everyone's at the same borrowing level, so there's no competition on that, and that was a product of the over exuberance that occurred during the GFC in Ireland. So where is the competition then in terms of banks not being able to price risk? Now, I suspect that will eventually adjust itself as their market stabilizes. But I thought it would be also interesting in terms of when we are comparing international cities, Bryce, and countries with ourselves, we tend to, look at the median house price in this market compared to Australia. It's so expensive, right? So we have this, this sound bite of knowledge, and that forms our thinking around that. Well, I just wanted to share with you some rough data. Yep. Minimum wage in the US, Bryce, is $7.52 per hour, which at a 75, I'm just using a long-term Australian dollar rate. It's actually been 78, but I'll use 75. That's $10.02 per hour is the minimum wage in America.
Yep.
Now that minimum wage in America, Bryce, the median house price in America is $329,000. Now, the minimum wage in Australia is $19.84. So that's a 98% increase, so $9.82 increase on the minimum wage in America. Now, our median house price in Australia is $550,000. So even though it's a 98% extra amount of income that we're earning, the price difference across the nation, or both nations, is only 67%. So that is interesting, right? I know America is made up of a very diverse marketplace, and you can buy houses over there for probably $1,500 still in some places. They would be in uninhabitable, but the reference is made to, that's the marketplace. And across Australia, again, people might be surprised that the median is only $550 because they're so used to hearing Sydney's median house price is $1 million and Melbourne's is $850 or whatever it is. Now, in Ireland, as an example, in terms of the median house price in Ireland is 267,000 euro, which equates to around 445,000 Australian dollars. Now, in Ireland, because they're part of the EU and they have a very, very healthy tax set up for companies. So I think their tax regime is 15% from memory. Don't quote me on that, but it's around that figure. That the minimum wage is actually really strong over there. So their monthly minimum wage, as a means of comparing it to Australia, theirs is $743. Ours is $1,923. So there's about a 10% difference. Now the difference in property prices is around 23%, but you can see that sort of rough correlation between the value of property is a product of income, which then relates to borrowing power, which then relates to house values. And what happened in Spain and in Ireland in the GFC or pre-GFC is interest rates in those markets were unbelievably low. Credit assessment and assessment rates meant borrowing power was exponential.
Easy access to credit. Yeah.
Easy access to credit. And that led to a building boom and a thriving economy, which all ended in tears because it was unjustifiable and it was unmonitored by not only the state-based and the country regulators, but also the risk regulators such as the Moody's and the rating agencies were also asleep at the wheel at that time. So I think it is about understanding that, yes, should we be benchmarking ourselves against other economies? Not so much in the property space. I mean, you can get that alignment, but what's more important, is around saying we do enjoy a very, very high minimum wage, and with that comes a higher cost of living, because any type of price is ultimately determined by demand and supply. And so if something is in limited supply but in high demand, then ultimately you're going to see a price appreciation in that area, and that's what we see in the Australian market.
So I guess to that point, that for us to admit that there is nothing inherently different about Australia from other countries, we cannot admit that.
No,
because
it's difficult.
But what we can admit is that we are certainly looking around the globe to see what it was that was the foundation of causing these people, these economies and these property markets to collapse, so that we can be aware of what that looks like. If you've got symptoms in Australia of easy access to credit, red flag. If you've got symptoms in Australia where unemployment is screaming up, red flag. If you have symptoms where you're seeing weapons of mass construction everywhere, Ben, where there's cranes everywhere, there's supply coming out of your wazoo, that is a red flag. Now, out of those three examples, the only one that you'd have at the moment on a watch and see is the unemployment rate, given the X Factor event that we're going through right now. And in unpacking that and having multiple experts on our podcast, Ben, not just our voice, Eliza Owen is a representative of a millennial generation, and she was with us a couple of weeks ago. There is nothing to suggest. No, actually, I'll rephrase that. The concentration of the unemployment challenge was in a specific demographic, younger Australians, who are typically in the renting space at this point in time, versus wholesale challenges in a demographic of folks who are got high mortgages or whatever. So I guess the unemployment flag is not something that we're ignoring. It's in fact something that we're acutely monitoring. But the conditions that would suggest that the property market is running away from us aren't there in mass, other than, I would say, the lack of stock right now is a from someone who's on the ground with a team of people, that is challenging. That's challenging.
Playing a role. It's playing a role in why what we predicted back in July.
Seagulls fighting over a chip.
Yep, that property prices will probably be across Australia increasing by the end of this year, and that's looking to even more than likely occur at the end of this month, or at the very least November, where we will see reports coming out that property prices are now growing in every capital city in the country and every and generally speaking the composition of regional areas, and that to us has been a product of that low supply. So it's not a given and then it's carte blanche, everything's going to fly, because we still do have some of those headwinds around what's going to happen with deferrals, loan deferrals, and the like. But
a March slope. Yep.
Yeah. So the strategy has been to move from a cliff to push it to a March slope, and then ultimately to probably make it into a sandhill so people can step off it. And that has been the right strategy, because the consequences of a collapsing housing market have far deeper ramifications to the broader economy, and the regulators and the smartest people in the room are acutely aware of that, and they will do everything possible to not throw the economy out with the property market in the event that they want to see that go down. So
there will be collateral damage, Ben. Some people will be affected.
Correct.
Some people will have the loans called in. Some people, but it's not as if these people, and we've spoken about this before, it's not as if everyone's done all this hard work to get us to March, and then they go, it's not working, and they go, oh, let's just let it collapse. It's, as you say, kick the can down the road. They will continue to make that a priority. So therefore, on that question, there is inherent differences about Australia from other places. And what I'll also remind is the DNA, the first principles of this podcast is that there are multiple markets, right? So inner, middle, outer, townhouse, apartment, houses. There is so much disparity around what we're even talking about as a property market here. So clearly asset selection is critical, but just being aware that it's almost like trying to compare whether LeBron's better than Jordan. It's difficult because there is so many. Like, I clearly think it's Jordan, right, for the record, but but it's so hard, because even if you think about the players even before you and I were born, Ben, it's very, very difficult to compare different scenarios and get them to be apples with apples. So therefore, I would caution anyone who's listening to this podcast to just be aware of the conditions, and we just hinted of those about 5 minutes ago, of what it is that you should be concerned about, so that you don't have to be worried about. Because the people who went through those things, I've actually looked at someone in the IBAN in our office who went through the Irish property crash, and I saw the pain in his eyes, and I saw the look in his eyes when I was talking to him saying, hey, listen, I don't necessarily think that we're going to go through that here. And it wasn't until we started to unpack some of the stuff we've been chatting about, because the pain was deep, the pain was real, and what that person went through was a harrowing experience for them, right? So again, not to belittle what's actually happened, but be aware of the conditions that cause that, rather than having just anxiety and fear without any basis.
Correct. And it probably, just to summarise the bears versus the bulls in this space, because the bears are getting, as per our client who was reading a lot of the bear analysis, they're now changing their tune from this is going to be a 30-40% property price crash to,
Yes.
well, maybe it's going to not be as bad and not even get to 10%, but that's all because the government, the government stepped in and saved everyone. Well, I think this is an important message. Government's jobs is to provide for its people, and part of that is to grow the economy. And so their job is to do whatever they can do to help the economy grow. The reason they're in government is we expect them to improve our living standards. We expect them to, have law and order. We expect them to give us opportunities for prosperity and to live the life that we want to live, right? That's their job. Now, when they see elements of the economy that have a flow-on effect, 60% of consumption through wealth effect and the property market and all of those types of things, they will do everything they can to protect any destabilizing elements that may impact the broader economy, and property is at the front and center of that conversation. So that's when Bryce was saying before, too big to fail. That's what you've got to understand, that the government understands that, and all of the powers that be from the RBA and so forth, they understand, because we don't have to look too far in terms of when property prices collapse and marketplaces collapse, economies go into deep recessions, i.e. Ireland, i.e. Spain, i.e. parts of America.
Japan.
So, Japan, they'll do everything they can. So just be mindful of that oh, well, it's only because the government came to the rescue. Maybe, but that is something that you need to understand. They're not going to come to each individual person's rescue. So don't just think that that's carte blanche, but more broadly speaking, they are not going to let the property market fail because there is too much at stake.
There we go. And then the final one there is the fourth point was admit the risk of a Japanese lost decade and drop in consumption and birth rates caused by high levels of household debt. I guess we've had a look at the population growth in that particular country, and it's been minimal, Ben. So it's actually almost a case study of, because they had some challenges clearly in the 90s, and the way that the triggers that they had to try and pull out of that and increase the consumption weren't there because there was no people sort of moving into that country, stimulating the excess demand. So therefore, they've had those long periods of time where that economy has actually been struggling. So I think it actually plays out to going back to the first point around, this is a case study of what happens if you don't grow your population base, because then you don't have that multiplier effect that you've talked about on many occasions, where someone landing is going to spend here, there to do the housing and to consume, to fill their house full of goods. It's actually a perfect illustration of what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very generalized here in terms of a quick history of Japan, right? But obviously, after the Second World War, their cities, their industries were decimated by the war, and they were able to retool and become a technology leader, and that bode incredibly well for their population. In terms of over the decades of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and became a leader in a lot of areas, and have put their DNA right across best practices on a lot of things, car industries, technologies, all of those types of things. Brilliant stuff. Their aging population, however, has been a catalyst for less consumption, because as they retired, they had less money to spend in the economy, and their belief in immigration, they don't want a cross-multicultural society. So for whatever reason, they're very proud of their culture and the people that they are. So they don't have a lot of immigration into the country, and because of the aging population, and also you've got to remember it's a very densely populated, 2 islands, right? So from that point of view,
Tokyo has the population of Australia in it.
Correct. Yeah. So single person per meter and all of that is ridiculous over there. So that's the construct of how their economy is working. Compare that to Australia, where we have a truckload of land, we have certainly significantly less density, and we have a multicultural society that has served us brilliantly well on the whole. That and will continue to do so with the people embracing multiculturalism, then our prosperity and our outlook looks amazing over short, medium, longer term. So that's for the people who are already here, so long as they put in and give effort and output and contribute, but also for those people who are coming here because they see it as an amazing opportunity to transform their lives. We'll see that sort of thing happening. So yes, property prices in Japan have stagnated. In some of the rural areas, they've gone backwards because there is no economic output there. Obviously, their wages growth put pressure on their competitiveness in terms of the goods that they sold. Because the irony is, if you go back in history and you look at some of the technology that they were releasing in the 60s, they were saying, oh, that's that cheap Japanese junk, right? And then they got it better and better and better. And then all of a sudden, Japan was known as quality technology. And then it was that cheap Taiwanese junk, right? And now Taiwan has got a really good name for high quality in terms of the televisions and the stuff that they're putting out there. And now it's the cheap Chinese knockoffs and all of those types. So you do go through these cycles in terms of, and when you do go through those cycles, you are lifting your people out of lower levels of standard of living into higher levels of standard of living, which we've seen what's happening in China. And that's great for that middle class, and they're going to have this century of prosperity, right? Where they are well positioned with household disposable income and consumption and internal consumption. They're going to have a prosperous time. But you also then look at America and you see that, that the Rust Belt of America, the Wisconsins and all of those areas, which are really challenged by the fact that industry and things have moved on from them, and their competitiveness has now been lost. And so they've lost industry, lost jobs, and that is a product of pressure on those particular economies and prices and property prices in those areas. So we still need to not rest on our laurels here in Australia. We absolutely need to make sure that Melbourne and Sydney continue to be financial capitals, knowledge centres, centres of excellence, and hopefully broadening those out to Queensland, in Brisbane and Adelaide. That's the flow over the decades that you get. And with that, you've probably got a really good story as Bernard Salt and you have articulated, Bryce, is that this will be a terrific decade where post pandemic we'll start to see some real joy coming into and another prosperous period for this fine nation.
The roaring 20s again, Ben. So there you go. From two Gen Xers speaking to a broader community, but clearly trying to address a millennial question. That is our response to those queries. So I guess we are more than open, Ben, on any level for millennials to come back to us. So what I'd suggest you do is send us an email, info@thepropertycouch.com.au. If you're a millennial and you have any further information that you'd like us to dissect on your behalf, we would love to do that, because we do want to be a representative of a prosperous country that includes baby boomers, us as X's, millennials, and I've also got, we've got kids of the same age, Ben, so we clearly got an eye on the future for them as well. So we would love to see where you think we hit the mark, where you think we didn't hit the mark, but we are well and truly open to your feedback. So send us an email, info@thepropertycouch.com.au, so that we can refer to that in an upcoming episode, Ben.
And one final takeaway, Bryce, because I do want a clear takeaway from where I sit, and that is, don't listen to the macro. Don't get caught up in the great debate about Australian property. You're not buying the Australian property market. You're buying one property in one street, in one suburb, in one localised government area, in one town or one city. So if you are interested in getting on the property ladder as a millennial, then the expectation that we put on you to hold yourself accountable is to do the research on looking at the demand and supply in that area. And you can do that through data. You can also do that through getting out there and going to open homes and understanding the interest in the marketplace, lining up your lending and doing what is right for you. All right. Don't listen to that external noise, because again, it comes back to you on your journey and setting your personal goals and financial goals. And if property is a part of that story, and you're in a position where you think that you can successfully execute on that, don't wait to save a 20% deposit if property prices are moving quicker in the area that you're looking to buy. This could be an opportunity for you. If not, sit on the sidelines, organise yourself, set up yourself for a 5-year plan or whatever it is to allow you to get into the market. But so that is the takeaway. We've gone global 30,000-foot view, but we now come down to the actionable items for each of you, and that is your story, and your opportunity is for you to hold yourself accountable to yourself around what you're planning to do. But do the research, look at the current demand, future supply, and you'll be sort of well served in that over the next 5 to 10 years if you take action.
Absolutely, Ben. And the tip from me is, if you're a millennial in Melbourne, buy a house in Geelong, Ballarat or Bendigo, do the yards there, and then creep back in, and your lifestyle will be pretty good. If you're in Sydney, go to the Central Coast or down to the Shire. If you're in Brisbane, buy a house on the Gold Coast. I've done it myself. I've commuted from Robina to Brisbane. I've done it for a whole year. So do not buy into the myth that millennials cannot buy real estate. It is not true. It is challenging if you want to be in the heart of a big city of Melbourne and Sydney. No question. Gotcha. Absolutely understand. But do not let go of the dream to buy a property based on some of the some of the headlines that you're seeing, because I can tell you from Ben and my perspective, from our vantage point, we see scores of millennials actually getting on the property ladder. So we want to encourage you, and but you may need to look outside the square if you live in Melbourne and Sydney, but you can circle back and come back if you're prepared, because the mortgage is lower in those locations. You can then build up the equity quicker, and then you can use that as leverage to move closer in, and before you know it, based on that dedicated path and some discipline, you will live in the suburb of your dreams, because you're prepared to show up when it matters, and you're prepared to invest in yourself, and you're prepared to do hard things. Because then if you do those hard things, you will get the rewards for that. So again, I want to throw it out to anyone who wants to give us some feedback, info@thepropertycouch.com.au. We will look to answer your questions, and we appreciate the feedback that we get from our clients, Ben, which started this podcast.
Yep.
Very brave to come and say that. Very brave to actually give us some feedback so that we can actually address it. And I hope that that's been of benefit to the entire community. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is an extension from last week. We had Joe Wilson regarding relationships. I talked about the relationship rules. One of the things that I've trialed and tested is a Tim Ferriss hack, where he gets together with his girlfriend and they go out on a date. And as part of that date, they ask 4 questions. I've done this now a couple of times with my wife, and it works wonderfully well, because we do know that the secret to a great relationship, Ben, is to increase communication. The better you communicate, the better your relationship. It's where, how do you get that strategy to land tactically is often the question, because you go, yeah, I've got to communicate with my partner. Sounds easy on paper, but then you know, when you're trying to actually open up the dialogue, what do you do? So these 4 questions. Number 1, ask these 4 questions on a date. Number 1, what they think they've been doing well or doing better. So I'll say, this is what I think, blah, blah, blah. And then the second question is, where do I think that I've dropped the ball or could focus more? And I'll say this here, that here. So it's actually allowing me to critique the wins and critique the training needs. But then it pivots to the other person, which is always a tricky scenario to give feedback to someone else, Ben. So I love the way that Tim does this. He goes, number 3, tell the other person what they're doing well. So that's nice and easy. But the 4th one is, this is what I think you should do better. Is not going to fly, right? Particularly with Dale Carnegie's wisdom. So the 4th question is what I'd love to see more of, right? So it's actually allowing the person to have dignity and not putting them on the no, getting the yes. So Tim Ferriss's 4 questions to ask on a date. Number 1, what they think they've been doing well or doing better. Number 2, what they think they've dropped the ball or could focus more. Number 3, what the other person is doing now well. Number 4, what I'd love to see more of. I've tried it a couple of times, Ben. It's working a treat. I encourage you to do it with Jane. What's making property news?
Mate, what making property news? Well, I'll start with the economy, because that's obviously what we've been talking a little bit about. But the Reserve Bank Deputy Governor, Guy Debelle, Bryce, has declared that Australia is technically out of recession.
Oh.
Yep. He believes that the slowdown or the shutdown in Victoria, things still got done. And so it hasn't been as bad as they first thought. So they believe that there will be a positive growth number in GDP for the September quarter. Won't be a big number, but it will be in positive. And obviously, if you're in positive, that means that your 2 negative quarters of negative economic growth have finished, which means if you're back into growth, you're out of recession.
Do we start another 29 years from here, Ben?
Correct. Hopefully, that would be nice.
Nice.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
The other fun story that I saw reported on was about the narrowest home in London, Bryce. Ooh. I don't know whether you caught this story.
I didn't, mate. No.
But the narrowest home in London, and this is how wide it is, Bryce. Yeah. It's 1.67 meters wide.
That's shorter than me. So okay.
So you're right. The story goes on, which is reported in the Sun paper over there and picked up, syndicated through news.com.au here, is that in some places you can't lie, diagonal. You can't lie down.
Shoot.
Because now, so this is in London, right? And there's a picture of it. It's a very cool it's an incredibly looking little place. Now it's a couple of stories tall. What do you reckon a property that's 1.67 meters wide, Bryce, would be selling for in downtown London?
It's not Mayfair, is it?
Well, let me give you a clue that the price is in the millions.
Oh yeah, no doubt. That's no surprise there. I don't know the answer because I'd be shooting in the wind. But clearly, there's a teaching moment here for the point that we talked about before, that if you want to have a $1.67 million, 1.6 meter wide house with an exorbitant mortgage, this is how you do it.
In Australian dollar terms, the asking price currently is $1,801,000.
Shoot.
So 995,000 quid.
Shoot. There you go.
So we'll put a link into the show notes. You can check it out. It's incredible. It's got some pics in terms. It's got a little deck out the back. It's got a little sunroom. But yeah, so you're basically going to be dropping 1.8 million on in Australian dollars terms if you want to have this narrowest house in London.
Wow, gives you some context around what money is being spent in other cities, isn't it, Ben, compared to when we think it's expensive here in Australia.
So that's what's making property news.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Hey, we've covered a fair bit today, Ben. I'm super hopeful that has added value to every person in our community, and particularly, as we said before, to Gen Xers talking to millennials. We hope we've hit the mark, but we'd certainly encourage your feedback, mate. But until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it.
All right, folks. See you next week.
Hey there folks, Bryce Holdaway here. Before you go, if you're new to our community and only listened to maybe a handful of episodes, I thoroughly recommend that you go all the way back to episode number 1, where we unpack all of the foundations when it comes to property investing. Now, for those of you that might be a little bit time poor, I've got good news for you. We have a binge guide that you can download straight away, which summarizes the first 20 episodes where Ben and I unpack the foundational pillars of the A, B, C, D, and so much more. And you can get that straight away. If you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20, you can download it and consume it whenever you want. It's completely free and available now. And for those of you, just a quick reminder that nothing we've spoken about today constitutes financial advice. We recommend that you reach out to your licensed professional advisor so that you can look at your unique circumstances before acting on any information. Now don't forget, go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and get your binge guide today.